What's up, everyone? Most content sites need a way to schedule or unschedule a piece of content. This can be challenging in a serverless or cached environment because there needs to be some kind of trigger that changes the status of that piece of content from unpublished to published or vice versa. Even beyond scheduling content, maybe you want a health check to send a ping to your server or your database to make sure that your site is working properly. That's where Payload's job queue comes into play. Using this tool from Payload, you can set up API routes to then be hit by cron jobs from services like Vogel and Railway, as well as your own self-hosted solution to either schedule or unschedule a post. In this video, I'll walk through two use cases, both with working examples on how to do this with Vogel, Railway, or Docploy to run the jobs. If you want the code I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. There are many ways to set up jobs, workflows, and tasks, but I'm going to focus on single tasks as that's going to be the primary use case that people are going to use this for. But for the sake of explanation, a task is a function that performs some kind of business logic that can then be used in a workflow which combines tasks together. These are tied together with jobs. In either case, with tasks or workflows, you'll need to define this in your payload config using the jobs option. And since we're focusing just on tasks, we'll open up our tasks array here. When jobs are enabled, a new hidden collection is added to your database called Payload Jobs. This collection either stores or deletes your tasks as they execute successfully. In addition to the collection, a new API endpoint is exposed as well, and that's API Payload Jobs Run. You can hit this endpoint just like any other API endpoint, but you can set a limit and a specific queue or all queues based on the parameters you feed to your fetch call. While this API is exposed by default, I'm going to take my first example by creating my own API route so I have the most flexibility. You queue tasks and workflows using payload jobs queue, and this can be called in either a hook or a route handler. Let's see it in action with a route handler first, and the use case we're going to use for this is an API health check. I want to set up a cron job that hits an API endpoint that queues up another job that executes every 6 hours. Let's get that started by going to our app directory and creating a new file that's going to be at API jobs health route.ts. In this file, we're going to import our next response and next request from next server, get payload from payload, and our config from payload config. We're going to export an async function called get, and we're going to capitalize our get here. And it's going to take a request of type next request. We can open this up and initialize our payload, and then we're going to try our health check. We're first going to await payload, and then we will queue up a job by creating a task called health check. And now here we're going to get some type errors, but those will go away once we generate types later on. In addition to this task, we're going to pass in an empty input as that's required by the job queue. Then we can run any pending job and store the result of those jobs in a constant called results. So that is equal to await payload jobs run. And then since this is a successful result, we're going to log it using our payload logger. And we'll just say health check successful. Then we can return our JSON response and pass in a body of success true, message health check job queued and executed successfully. Then we will provide a timestamp, and then we can return our jobs processed by checking if results is an array, and if it is, we'll return the results length. Otherwise, we will return 0. Then if it fails, we can catch our error E, and then we will use our payload logger error to log our error E and say health check runner error. Then we can return our next response JSON with a body of error, failed to run health check. Then we will return some details, which will first check if our error is instance of error. If it is, we're going to return the error message. Otherwise, we will just say it's an unknown error. And then finally, we can return a status of 500. For a little bit more flexibility, we're also going to support our post function. So we will just export async function post, which will again be a request of type next request, and then we'll just return get request. You'll likely want to secure this route handler, just so some random stranger isn't able to queue up a job for you. And you can do this by generating a random 32 character secret by running openSSL rand base6432. And then you can save this as your cron secret. I already have one, so I'm gonna move forward with what I have. And here after the try, but before our job queue, we're going to set a constant called auth header, and we're gonna get our authorization header. Then we can store our constant cron secret and set that equal to our environment variable of cron secret. Then we can check if auth header does not equal our cron secret, but as a bearer token, we can return a next response JSON with an error of unauthorized, and then a status of 401. One last thing I'll do in my health check queue here is add a queue option and just include this as health check. That way it does not fall into the default queue. And then that means in this run, we can also just pass in queue and use the health check queue to keep things all consistent. Now, in order to actually check our API health, we're going to need a new file that will be our health route handler. And this will be very simple. We're going to get our next response from next server and then export an async function called get, which will take no props, and it'll just return a new next response of OK. Now we'll be able to hit this route to make sure that our API is in good condition. You are able to do more checks in here, but I just want to get a simple response that the server is OK. Now we need a way to tell Payload to run the job, and that's what our payload config is here for. So we're going to come all the way down to our jobs tasks array, and then we need to pass this in as an object, and we'll add a slug called health check, and this is going to match what we included in our route handler. And then we need a handler, which will have an async anonymous function. Here we'll just pass in our request object, and then we're going to store our results with a timestamp, which will be a new date, and that'll be transformed to ISO string. Then we can initialize our errors, which will be an empty array, which will take strings. And then we will get our checks and initialize those first to check the database, and that initial value will be false, and our API, which will also be false. We'll add a try catch statement here. And in the try, we will try to await our payload find to look in our collection of users and just grab one user. And if this works, we can say that our database check passes. So we'll just set that equal to true. Otherwise, we'll need to, again, catch our error E, and I'm going to send myself an email. So I'm going to set request payload send email, and I'm going to send this to my email. And then we'll need to pass in some HTML, which will just say health check failed, and we will give our error if it's an instance of error. If it is, we will give our error message. Otherwise, it'll be an unknown error. Then we can push our results to our errors array and say database check failed. Then we're going to try to get our server responding. So we'll store our URL in a constant called server URL, which will be our environment variable called next public server URL. And if that doesn't exist, we can just use localhost for testing. Then we can store our response, and that will await the fetch of our server URL API health route that we just created. If our response is okay, we will say that our API check is true, it passes. Else, we can then push our errors to the error array saying API health check returned response status. That way we get the status code if it fails. We can then catch our error E and push our results into our errors array and just say API check failed. Then we can store in a constant called all healthy that our object values from our results checks object has every value set equal to true. And we can simplify this by just returning check. If all healthy is false, we can log that in our payload logger error. We can return the message health check failed. And then again, send an email. So request payload send email to my email, and then return an HTML string. And we'll just make this in H2 that says health check failed. Else we can log with our payload logger info that all systems are healthy. Then we can return our output results. And finally down here we can catch our error E and log it using the payload error logger and say health check error, and then we can throw our error. I want this to retry once, and so we stay type safe, I can say that this whole thing is a task config of health check. And then we can run payload generate types. Now we see our type error disappear there, and it disappears here now that health check exists on our jobs queue. That's it for the health check. Now in order to test this out, you can set your cron secret equal to your environment variable that you generated. Again, I already have mine, so I'm going to clear this. Instead, I'm just going to run my development server using pnpm dev, and I can go to my API jobs health endpoint, and going here, I see that I'm unauthorized, and that's because I'm not logged in and I don't have my cron secret sending to the headers. So in my new terminal, I'll type in curl and then pass in our headers, which will just be an authorization header with bearer of cron secret. And then we can hit our endpoint, which will be our local host 3000 API jobs health. And so close that quote and hit enter. And we can see that we have a success message that says success was true, health check job queued and executed successfully. So now if I go over to my other terminal, I can see all systems healthy, health check successful, as well as a little bit of info saying that one job is being run. Before covering our second use case, check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Payload CMS, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and more. Tired of trying to keep up with all of the industry news? Sign up for my bi-weekly newsletter, Next in Dev, that will include all of the news and topics that you would need to know in the web development industry. There's a link to that in the description. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to it. One other use case is scheduling posts. We can set this up much the same way we did for our health check, But in this instance, we're actually able to rely on Payload CMS's job queue tools. You'll first need to make sure that you have a collection that has drafts schedule publish set to true. I have my posts set up in that way, so I'm good to go there. Now, if you're not sure how to do this, I do have a video on how to enable versions, drafts, and live preview, and there's a link to that in the description. Once this is enabled and you go to your admin UI, and if we go over to our blog posts, then we can make a change, save a draft, and then we see the schedule publish option pop up, and we can follow these instructions to publish based on locale and based on time. So what this does is we can set a time zone and set a time to have this post be scheduled. We can set it to publish in English, then we hit save, and this is going to run a hook that will then queue this job up to be published later on. But we don't have this set up quite yet, so let's do that now before we run out of time and this needs to post. In order to keep our config clean, we're going to go to our utilities and create a new file called schedule publish in the jobs directory. So we can add schedule publish.ts to the jobs directory. And we're going to import a few things from payload, which will be our collection slug, our task handler arguments, and our task input. We can then export a new constant called schedule publish with a slug of schedule publish, but in camel case. And then we will allow for one retry, and then we need our handler function, which again will be an async anonymous function. Now, in order to stay type safe, we're going to give our arguments the task handler args type of schedule publish, and we can give our props of job and rec, and then we will pull out type and doc from our job input, which will have the type of task input, but specifically for schedule publish. Then we'll check if there is no document or the document's relation to is not equal to posts. We can log that in our payload logger as a warning that schedule publish job called for non-post document. And then just as a notification, we're skipping this. Then we can return our output, which will be success true, skipped true. Then we can try to publish the document. So we'll add a try catch statement here, and we'll try if type is equal to publish. We can find our post by ID in the collection of doc relation to, and this will be a collection config, and this will be a collection slug. Then we'll pass in our ID of doc value as string, and then pass in draft true. If there's no post, we can send ourselves an email using payload send email, and we'll send this to myself. And then an HTML string saying in an H2 that scheduled publishing failed. Now, again, we can add more information here, but the H2 will do for now. And then after this, we can return our output to be success, false, error, and we'll just do doc relation to not found, and we don't need our skipped there. Then we can publish the post. So we'll do constant of publish post, and we will await our payload update method for our collection of relation to as collection slug. Then we need our ID, which will be doc value as string. And then we need to update our status field to published and set draft to false. And since this is successful, we will send ourselves another email. That'll be to, again, myself. And we will pass in HTML that says H2 scheduled publishing success. Then we can return output, success is true, published at new date to ISO string, and then an ID of publish post ID. Then we'll catch our error E and log that using our payload logger and say something like error in schedule publish job, and then return the error E. And one more time, I'll send myself an email that simply says scheduled publishing failed. And finally, throw our error. Then we need to add this to our payload config. So I can do that after this task by just importing our scheduled publish TypeScript file and give it the task config type for schedule publish. And we can test this job locally as well. So back over here, I can change this from API jobs to API payload jobs run. And when I hit enter, I see that I'm unauthorized. And that's because I need to pass in to my jobs option an access object. So I will add access for our run endpoint for a request, which will be of type payload request. And in this request, if a user is present, return true. So anytime someone is logged in and hits this endpoint, return true. Anybody can access it if they're authorized. Otherwise, we're going to return our bearer of our environment variable cron secret and check if that's equal to our request headers, which we're going to get the authorization headers. Now I can save this and try again. And I see that there's a message of success, no jobs remaining, and remaining jobs from queried 0. And coming over to the server, I scheduled this too far in advance, so I don't see any errors or notifications here. But now if I delete this job and set a time for just a minute into the future, and now that it's been a minute, we can run it again and see now that our blog2 changed from changed to published. There are many ways that you can deploy your Payload CMS and Next.js project, and most of them have a way to hit these API routes using a cron job. Let's start with Vercel. When you deploy to Vercel, you don't have a persistent server running. That means you'll need to rely on their built-in cron functionality. On the free plan, you can have up to 2 cron jobs that are triggered once per day. On the pro plan, you get up to 40 cron jobs and unlimited triggers down to the minute. To use Vercel's cron job, you need an API route, a cron secret, and a vercel.json file. We've already created the route handlers we need and the cron secret, so let's move on to the vercel.json file. We can do that by going to the root of our file and creating a new file called vercel.json. And in this file, we're going to open up an object that will take our crons array, which will first have a path, which we will use a relative path for our health check API route, and then a schedule. And of course, we need to use double quotes here, not single quotes. And then our schedule is going to be regular cron notation. So I'm going to do the 0th minute of every 6 hours, and then pass in asterisks for the rest of the values. And then we need another path, which will be our API payload jobs run, and a schedule of every 5 minutes. We also need a way to have Railway handle this, and they do that in a TOML file. So I'm going to create a new file called railway.toml, and I am going to then have services jobs health be created with a source image of curl images, curl 8.8.0, and then start curl SF, pass in the headers of authorization bearer cron secret. And then on the next line, HTTP, then our web railway private domain with double curly braces here. Then it'll be at the web's port with API jobs health. And we can close off the quotes there. And this actually needs to be on a single line. So after that, we can set our cron schedule. Now with Railway, you can only schedule every 5 minutes and up. For the health check, that doesn't matter so much. We can do the 0th minute of every 6 hours, and then the rest of these can be the wildcard values. And then we'll set up our services, jobs run, source image equals, again, curl images, curl 8.8.0, start. And I'm going to copy this and paste it here and change this to be our payload jobs run. And then I'm going to have it run all queues and set that equal to true. And then we will do this cron at the fastest interval where allowed, which is going to be every 5 minutes. It's important to note that, especially with Railway, your cron jobs need to have a clean start and a clean finish. If they don't, then your job's going to continue to run, and it's just going to drive up your Railway bill and keep the server alive, and your jobs will fail. And another way you might do this is through a self-hosted service like Docploy or Coolify. Docploy and Coolify both have schedules sections where you can define the APIs to be hit by the cron job and how often. In Docploy, you'll go to schedules, then click add schedule. And when you do that, you can name a task, define a schedule based on a custom expression or a predefined schedule, choose your shell type, and then enter in your desired command. I typically use shell and wget for this, but you can use curl and bash or whatever else you're comfortable with. And that's it for working with Payload CMS jobs. We covered how to set up route handlers to deal with the logic of your jobs, how to set up your Payload CMS config to run your jobs, and then how to host your project and have it run in a production environment. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who also might find this helpful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you never miss when I release more content about Payload CMS, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and more. Remember to sign up for my bi-weekly newsletter, Next in Dev. That way you can stay up to date, not just with my videos, but with all of the news that's happening in our industry today. Again, there's a link to that in the description. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.